The darkness and the encounter. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the forest in hues of deep crimson and shadow. The air was still, heavy with the scent of moss and decaying leaves, as though the entire woods were holding its breath. A narrow, moss-covered path wound through the thick trees, untouched by modern life for decades. The occasional call of a bird or rustle of an animal was swallowed by the oppressive silence. On this path, a small wheelchair creaked forward, its worn wheels struggling against the uneven terrain. In it sat a young girl, her fragile frame dwarfed by the vast expanse of the forest around her. Her dark eyes darted nervously, clutching an old, tattered plush bear close to her chest. Her name was Amara, and she felt more vulnerable than she ever had before. The silence was too complete, broken only by the occasional groan of the wheelchair's joints. Each sound made her flinch, her heart racing as though the shadows themselves were alive. She bit her lip, trying to muster courage. Suddenly, a sound broke through, a snap like a twig being crushed underfoot. Amara's hands froze on the wheels, her eyes scanning the dim woods. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling and small. No answer. The sound came again, louder this time, closer. She spun her chair toward the noise, her breath hitching in her throat. Out of the dense forest stepped a man, tall and imposing, dressed in a police uniform. His presence seemed out of place against the desolate backdrop. His face was lined with years of authority, but his smile, strained and menacing, betrayed an intent far darker than his attire suggested. "Lost, are we?" he asked, his voice smooth but dripping with something that made her stomach churn. Amara's hands instinctively gripped the armrests of her wheelchair tighter, as if they could shield her. "I just want to go home," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The man stepped closer, his polished boots crunching on the path's gravel. His eyes studied her with a mix of curiosity and disdain. "Home," he repeated, his tone mocking. "Don't you think this forest is your home now?" His words hung in the air like a dark omen. Amara's breathing quickened, tears pooling in her eyes. She tried to turn her wheelchair, to move away, but the man reached out and gripped the handle, stopping her. "Let go," she cried, her voice breaking. He leaned in, his face uncomfortably close. "No one's coming for you," he hissed. "People like you. No one cares." His words cut deeper than any physical blow, leaving her paralyzed by fear and helplessness. Her mind screamed for a way out, for someone, anyone, to save her. But the forest remained indifferent, the trees standing like silent witnesses. Amara clung to her bear, the only semblance of safety she had left, but the man's gaze fell on it. "This," he said, reaching out and snatching it from her trembling hands. "This is what you think will protect you. No, please, don't," she begged, reaching for the toy, but he held it out of reach. The man sneered, examining the bear as if deciding its worth. "Trash, just like you," he said before flinging it toward the edge of a nearby cliff. Amara screamed as she watched her only comfort disappear into the abyss. Her sobs filled the air, but the man only laughed. He took a step back, folding his arms as he watched her despair with cruel satisfaction. "That's the problem with people like you," he said, his tone dripping with venom. "You think the world owes you something. Newsflash, it doesn't." Amara's tears slowed as a flicker of defiance lit in her eyes. She didn't know where it came from, but deep within her, a fire started to burn, a small, stubborn refusal to let this man break her. He noticed the change and leaned closer, his expression darkening. "What's that look for? Think you can fight me? Go ahead." For a moment, Amara hesitated, her mind racing. She had no idea what to do, but the fire in her wouldn't let her stay still. She gripped the wheels of her chair and shoved with all her might. The wheelchair jerked forward, and for a moment, the man was caught off guard. "What the?" he exclaimed, stumbling back. Amara didn't look back. She pushed forward, her hands working the wheels with a desperation born of survival. The uneven path jostled her, threatening to tip her over, but she pressed on. The man's angry shout echoed behind her. "You think you can escape me?" he roared, his boots crunching as he chased after her. "You're only making it worse for yourself." But Amara didn't stop. Her arms burned, her palms stung from the effort, but she kept going, knowing that stopping meant the end. Ahead, the path narrowed, the forest growing denser. She glanced back and saw him gaining on her, his face twisted in rage. Her heart pounded, her body screaming for rest, but she pushed harder. Then disaster struck. A root protruded from the path, catching one of the wheelchair's wheels. The sudden jolt threw Amara forward, and she tumbled out of the chair, landing hard on the ground. Pain shot through her body, but she barely had time to register it before she heard his footsteps closing in. "Well, well," he said, his voice oozing triumph. "Look where running got you." Amara turned to see him looming over her, a cruel smile on his face. She scrambled backward, her hands clawing at the dirt, but there was nowhere to go. Behind her was the cliff's edge, and in front of her was the man who wanted to end her. He knelt, grabbing her by the arm and dragging her toward the edge. "No one's going to miss you," he said, his voice cold and final. Amara's mind raced, her eyes darting desperately for any way out. And then she heard it, a voice calling her name. "Amara." The man froze, his grip tightening. The voice called again, closer this time, filled with urgency and anger. "Amara." Hope surged in her chest as she recognized the voice. It was her father. The man snarled, yanking her closer to the edge. "No one's coming for you," he hissed. But Amara knew he was wrong. A father's fury. Amara's heart pounded in her chest as the echo of her father's voice cut through the sinister tension in the air. She could barely believe it. He had come for her. The policeman's grip on her arm tightened, his sneer replaced with a flicker of unease. "Your father, huh?" he muttered, glancing over his shoulder toward the darkening woods. "Let him come. He can't stop what's already in motion." Amara's lips trembled as tears streaked her dirt-covered face. Despite her fear, hope began to bloom. If anyone could stand against this monster, it was her father. The sound of hurried footsteps grew louder, crashing through the underbrush like a storm. Moments later, a tall, broad-shouldered figure emerged from the trees. Amara's father, Marcus, stood at the edge of the clearing, his eyes wide with horror as he took in the scene before him. "Amara," Marcus shouted, his voice raw with anguish. "Dad." Amara's cry was a mixture of relief and desperation. Marcus's gaze swept over his daughter, her overturned wheelchair, and the smug man holding her perilously close to the cliff's edge. The sight sent a surge of fury coursing through him. His jaw clenched, and his fists balled so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The policeman straightened, his smirk returning as he stepped closer to the edge, dragging Amara with him. "Stay where you are," he barked, his voice laced with venom. "One step closer, and she goes over." Marcus froze, his chest heaving as he fought the urge to charge forward. His eyes locked onto Amara's, silently willing her to hold on. "Let her go," he said, his voice calm but edged with an unmistakable threat. "Whatever you think you're doing, this ends now." The policeman laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the clearing. "Ends now? You don't get it, do you? People like you don't dictate what happens. I do." Marcus took a slow step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "You don't have to do this. Let her go, and we can talk about whatever it is you're trying to prove." The policeman's face twisted into a sneer. "Talk? You think I want to talk? No, I want you to understand what it feels like to be powerless, to know you can't protect what matters most to you." Amara whimpered as the man's grip on her tightened, his fingers digging into her arm. Marcus's eyes darkened, his fury barely contained. "You've already lost," Marcus said, his voice low and steady. "You just don't know it yet." The policeman's smirk faltered for a moment before he sneered again. Big talk from a man with no leverage. He yanked Amara closer to the edge, her small body trembling in his grasp. "You take another step, and I'll make sure she's gone before you can even blink." Marcus's heart clenched as he saw Amara's feet dangling perilously close to the void. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to act, but he knew one wrong move could cost his daughter her life. "I won't let you hurt her," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "You want me? Fine. But let her go first." The policeman chuckled, shaking his head. "Nice try. But I don't need you. I just need to show you that you're nothing. That your kind will always be at the mercy of people like me." Amara's small voice cut through the tension. "You're wrong," she said, her words trembling but defiant. "We're not nothing." The policeman glanced down at her, his sneer returning. "Oh, you've got some fight in you, huh? Too bad it won't matter." Marcus took another step forward, his hands lowering to his sides as his posture shifted. The calm facade gave way to raw determination, and his voice dropped to a growl. "Let her." The policeman's eyes darted between Marcus and Amara, a flicker of uncertainty betraying his confidence, but he quickly masked it with bravado, yanking Amara even closer to the edge. "Or what?" the policeman taunted. "You'll play hero. Face it, you've already lost." Marcus moved in a blur. Before the policeman could react, Marcus lunged forward, closing the distance between them in an instant. His powerful hands grabbed the man's wrist, forcing him to release Amara. The girl stumbled backward, landing on her hands and knees as Marcus shoved the policeman away from the cliff. The man staggered, his balance faltering, but he quickly regained his footing. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," the policeman growled, reaching for the baton at his belt. Marcus positioned himself between Amara and the policeman, his body coiled like a spring. "No," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. "The biggest mistake was thinking you could hurt my daughter and walk away." The policeman swung the baton, aiming for Marcus's head, but Marcus ducked, his instincts honed by years of discipline and hard work. He countered with a punch to the man's stomach, the force of the blow doubling him over. Amara watched, her heart racing as the two men clashed. Her father fought with a ferocity she had never seen before, his every move precise and deliberate. The policeman, though strong, was no match for Marcus's sheer willpower. The fight raged on, each blow landing with the weight of years of pent-up rage and injustice. The policeman managed to land a glancing strike with the baton, but Marcus barely flinched. He grabbed the weapon, ripping it from the man's grasp, and tossing it over the edge of the cliff. The policeman's eyes widened with fear as Marcus loomed over him, his chest heaving with exertion. "You think you're untouchable," Marcus said, his voice trembling with controlled fury. "But you're nothing without that badge. Just a coward hiding behind power." The policeman lunged at Marcus in desperation, but Marcus sidestepped, grabbing him by the collar and forcing him to the ground. He pinned the man beneath him, his face inches away. "You will never hurt her again," Marcus growled, his voice like thunder. The policeman struggled, his confidence shattered, as Marcus's words rang out like a sentence. Amara, still trembling, watched as her father finally rose, leaving the defeated man lying in the dirt. Marcus turned to his daughter, his eyes softening as he knelt beside her. "It's over," he said, pulling her into his arms. "You're safe now." Amara clung to him, tears streaming down her face as relief washed over her. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. The fight for justice had just begun. The gathering storm. The forest settled into an uneasy silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. Marcus held Amara close, his hand gently cradling the back of her head as her sobs racked her small frame. He glanced down at her, the dirt and tears on her face only intensifying his resolve. She was alive. That was all that mattered. Behind him, the defeated policeman groaned, his breath sagged. Marcus turned his head, his eyes narrowing at the man sprawled on the ground. A surge of anger coursed through him as he recalled the man's hateful words, his smugness, his cruelty. For a brief moment, Marcus considered dragging the man to the cliff's edge and letting him experience the same fear he had inflicted on his daughter. But Marcus wasn't that man. He wasn't a monster. He shifted his attention back to Amara, whispering gently, "You're okay, sweetheart. I've got you. No one's going to hurt you again." Amara pulled back slightly, her voice trembling. "Dad, he said things. He said no one would care. That I'm—" Her words broke off, the weight of what she had endured pressing down on her like a boulder. Marcus cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "Amara, listen to me," he said, his voice firm but tender. "You are strong. You are brave. And you mean everything to me. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you're less than what you are." She nodded, though the fear still lingered in her wide eyes. From behind them, the policeman groaned louder, pushing himself up onto his knees. His face was bloodied, his uniform torn and stained with dirt. His eyes glinted with malice as he spat. "You think you're a hero. This isn't over. People like me don't lose to people like you." Marcus's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. He stood, his towering frame casting a shadow over the man. "You're done," Marcus said, his voice a low growl. "You don't touch my daughter again. You don't touch anyone again." The policeman sneered, a sick grin spreading across his face. "You think this ends here? You'll be the one in cuffs by morning. You laid a hand on an officer of the law." Marcus's heart pounded as he realized the truth in the man's words. No matter the righteousness of his actions, the system often protected those in power over those who sought justice. He knew he had to tread carefully. "Stay down," Marcus ordered, pointing a finger at the man. "Don't make this worse for yourself." The policeman laughed, a cold and humorless sound. "Worse? I'm going to enjoy watching you squirm. You don't have a chance, not with your record. I know who you are, Marcus Reed. A man with a past, trying to play family man. No one will believe you over me." Marcus stiffened. The mention of his past felt like a knife in his chest. He had worked hard to leave that life behind, to build a stable, loving environment for Amara. He wouldn't let this man ruin everything he had fought for. Suddenly, the sound of voices echoed through the trees. Marcus turned, his senses on high alert. Two figures emerged from the shadows, both wearing police uniforms. The flashlights they carried cut through the darkness, their beams landing on Marcus, Amara, and the disheveled man on the ground. "What the hell is going on here?" one of the officers demanded, his voice sharp. The wounded policeman smirked, his expression shifting to one of mock pain. "Thank God you're here," he said, his voice dripping with false relief. "This lunatic attacked me and tried to throw me off the cliff." Marcus's fists clenched as he stepped in front of Amara protectively. "That's a lie," he said, his voice steady. "He's the one who attacked my daughter. He tried to kill her." The second officer, a younger man with a cautious demeanor, glanced between the two men. "Everyone needs to calm down," he said, his hand hovering near his holstered gun. "Let's get the story straight." The wounded policeman chuckled, wiping blood from his lip. "Story? Look at me. I'm the victim here. This guy went crazy and attacked me out of nowhere. He's dangerous." The first officer, a tall man with a hardened expression, stepped closer to Marcus. "Is that true? Did you assault him?" Marcus took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering. "I defended my daughter. He dragged her to the edge of the cliff and threatened to kill her." The wounded policeman let out a bark of laughter. "What a story. Do you hear this guy? He's trying to make me out to be the bad guy." The younger officer hesitated, his flashlight beam landing on Amara. The sight of the terrified girl, her wheelchair overturned and her small body trembling, seemed to give him pause. "Sir," he said softly, addressing Marcus, "is she okay?" Marcus nodded. "She's shaken, but she's alive. Thanks to me, not him." The first officer frowned, his eyes narrowing. "We'll get to the bottom of this," he said, his tone clipped. "But right now, you're both coming with us." Marcus's heart sank. "What? You're arresting me?" "Detaining," the officer corrected. "We need to figure out what happened here, and we can't do that with tempers flaring." "Detaining," Marcus repeated, his voice rising. "He's the one who attacked her. Check the evidence. Look at her wheelchair. Look at the ground by the cliff." The wounded policeman interjected, his voice smug. "Evidence. All anyone will see is an angry man who attacked a cop." Amara found her voice, trembling but firm. "He's lying," she said, her small voice cutting through the tension. "He tried to hurt me. My dad saved me." The younger officer looked at her, his expression softening. "We'll get this sorted out," he said, though his uncertainty was clear. The first officer motioned to Marcus. "Hands behind your back." Marcus hesitated, his eyes flicking to Amara. "I'm not leaving her." "You don't have a choice," the officer said, stepping closer. Before Marcus could respond, Amara clutched his arm, her voice strong despite her fear. "No, you can't take him. He's the only one who protects me." The officers exchanged glances, the weight of the situation hanging in the air. Marcus knelt down, placing his hands on Amara's shoulders. "It's okay, baby," he said softly. "This isn't over. I'll make sure you're safe. Always." Amara nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. As the officers led Marcus and the wounded policeman toward their patrol cars, the forest seemed to close in around them. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. Marcus knew he would have to fight harder than ever to protect his daughter, not just from physical harm, but from a system that seemed stacked against them. The fight for truth. Marcus sat on the cold, metal bench of the holding cell, his mind racing. The dim overhead light flickered intermittently, casting fleeting shadows across the room. The muted hum of voices from the officers outside the cell was drowned out by his own thoughts. He had spent the past hour replaying every moment of the harrowing encounter with the policeman in the woods. Amara's face lingered in his mind. The fear in her eyes, the trembling in her voice, and the courage she mustered despite the circumstances. She was his everything, and he had promised her safety. But now, separated by walls and bars, he felt powerless. Across the station, in a separate room, Amara sat in a chair far too large for her, clutching a blanket that one of the kinder officers had draped over her shoulders. Her small hands gripped the armrests, and her eyes darted nervously around the room. A female officer sat across from her, a notebook in hand, trying to coax her into recounting the events. "You're safe here, sweetie," the officer said softly. "Can you tell me what happened?" Amara's lips quivered as she glanced at the door, longing for her father's reassuring presence. "He tried to hurt me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who did?" the officer asked, leaning forward. "The man in the uniform," Amara replied, her voice trembling. "He called me useless. He said no one would care if I was gone." The officer's pen paused mid-scribble, her brow furrowing. She exchanged a glance with the other officer in the room, who leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Are you saying the officer we brought in threatened you?" Amara nodded, her tears welling up again. "My dad stopped him. He saved me." The officer sighed, placing the notebook down. "Okay, we're going to sort this out. But we need you to stay calm and tell us everything, okay?" Amara nodded again, her small frame trembling under the weight of the moment. Meanwhile, Marcus stared at the bars of his cell, frustration mounting with every passing second. He knew how this would look: a father with a history of arrests, accused of assaulting an officer. He could practically hear the voices of the jury already. But he also knew the truth, and he wasn't going to let Amara's voice be silenced. A sharp clang broke his train of thought as the cell door slid open. A gruff-looking officer gestured for him to step out. "Interrogation room," he said curtly. Marcus stood, his broad shoulders squared, and followed the officer down the narrow hallway. The walls seemed to close in on him, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like insects. When he entered the room, He was met by two detectives seated at the table. One was a middle-aged man with a salt and pepper beard, his expression unreadable. The other was a younger woman, her sharp eyes scanning Marcus as though she were trying to see past the surface. "Have a seat," the man said, gesturing to the chair across from them. Marcus complied, his expression resolute. "You know why you're here," the woman began, flipping open a folder. "Assault on an officer. A serious accusation." Marcus leaned forward, his eyes meeting hers without flinching. "I defended my daughter from a man who was about to kill her." The detectives exchanged glances. "According to Officer Grant," the man said, referring to the wounded policeman, "you ambushed him in the forest, knocked him unconscious, and tried to throw him off a cliff. That doesn't sound like self-defense." Marcus's fists clenched under the table, but he kept his tone steady. "Grant is lying. He dragged my daughter to the edge of that cliff. He called her worthless and threatened her life. If I hadn't been there, she wouldn't be alive right now." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Do you have any evidence to back that up?" Marcus's jaw tightened. The marks on the ground by the cliff, her wheelchair, her testimony. "We're collecting evidence," the man said, his tone neutral. "But we have to consider all accounts, including Officer Grant's, and his injuries make his story plausible." Marcus slammed his palm on the table, his frustration boiling over. "You're protecting him because he's one of you. That man is a predator in a uniform, and you're going to let him walk because it's easier than admitting he's a disgrace to the badge." The younger detective narrowed her eyes. "Watch your tone, Mr. Reed." "I'll use whatever tone I need," Marcus shot back. "My daughter was almost killed, and you're treating me like the criminal." The older detective leaned back, his expression unreadable. "We'll let the evidence speak for itself, but I'd suggest you keep a cool head if you want us to hear you out." Marcus glared at him, but said nothing further. Back in the evidence room, the younger officer who had spoken with Amara stood over a table, examining items recovered from the scene. Amara's overturned wheelchair, the scuffed baton, and the scraped ground samples told a story, one that conflicted with Grant's polished version. The officer frowned, her conscience tugging at her. Something about Grant's demeanor during the initial debrief had unsettled her. His smugness, his lack of concern for the girl. She flipped open her notebook and reviewed Amara's testimony, the details she provided, the insults, the threats, the specific words Grant had used, were consistent with signs of emotional trauma. The officer bit her lip, considering her next move. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Another officer entered, holding a small evidence bag containing a body camera. "We recovered this from Grant's uniform," he said, handing it to her. She raised an eyebrow. "Was it on during the incident?" "Looks like it," he replied. "Should be interesting to see what's on it." She nodded, her heart racing as she plugged the camera into the station's system. The grainy footage flickered to life on the monitor, and the room fell silent as the events in the forest unfolded before her eyes. Marcus was escorted back to his cell, his mind a whirlwind of anger and despair. He sat down heavily, burying his face in his hands. He had fought with everything he had to protect Amara, but now he was fighting an entirely different kind of battle, one he wasn't sure he could win. Just as he was about to sink further into his thoughts, the cell door clanged open again. He looked up to see the younger officer standing there, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice steady. "Come with me." Marcus hesitated, then stood. As he followed her down the hallway, he noticed a change in her demeanor, a seriousness that hadn't been there before. When they reached the evidence room, she gestured to the monitor. "We found this," she said simply. Marcus stepped closer, his heart pounding as he watched the footage. The video captured everything: the threats, the insults, the moment Grant dragged Amara toward the cliff. Marcus's fists clenched as he relived the horror, but he forced himself to focus. The footage was damning, and it was the lifeline he needed to clear his name and protect Amara. The officer turned to him, her eyes meeting his. "This changes everything," she said. Marcus nodded, his resolve hardening. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt the scales begin to tip in his favor. The storm breaks. The cold interrogation room fell silent as Marcus sat across from the detectives once again. This time, the air was charged with tension, the stakes higher than ever. The younger officer who had discovered the body camera footage stood in the corner, arms crossed, her gaze unwavering. The older detective cleared his throat, leaning forward. On the table between them sat the evidence bag containing the body camera, its mere presence a challenge to the narrative Officer Grant had tried to spin. "Mr. Reed," the older detective began, his tone more measured now, "we've reviewed new evidence. It's illuminating." Marcus's sharp gaze flickered to the camera. "Illuminating," he repeated, his voice steady but edged with anger. "That's one way to describe it. Let me guess, you've seen what really happened. You've seen your officer for what he is." The younger detective shifted uncomfortably, but the older one held up a hand, gesturing for calm. "We'll get to that," he said. "First, we want to hear your account again. This time, with everything on the table." Marcus took a deep breath, his fists resting on the table. "You've got the footage. You don't need me to tell you again what happened. But if you want to hear it from me, fine. I was out looking for my daughter. She'd gone ahead on her wheelchair while I was packing up our things from the park. When I found her, she was near the cliff. And that man, Grant, had her. He was taunting her, threatening her life. He even threw her toy over the edge to scare her. He said things." Marcus paused, his voice breaking slightly. "Things no man should ever say to a child. And then he dragged her to the edge. That's when I stepped in." The older detective nodded slowly, his fingers steepled as he listened. "You stepped in and assaulted him." Marcus's eyes darkened. "I defended my daughter. You call it assault if you want. But if I hadn't done something, she wouldn't be alive. He was going to kill her." The younger officer interjected, her voice clear and steady. "The footage corroborates his account. Grant's behavior was unacceptable." She hesitated, as though searching for the right words, then continued. "He abused his authority and escalated the situation to the point of endangering a child's life." The older detective leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Let's see the footage again." The younger officer stepped forward, inserting the body camera chip into the station's computer. The monitor on the wall lit up, and the room grew still as the video began to play. The footage was as damning as Marcus had hoped. The grainy video showed Grant approaching Amara, his voice dripping with mockery as he hurled insults and threats. The camera caught every word, every sneer, and every moment of Amara's terror. Marcus's jaw clenched as he watched the man snatch her teddy bear and toss it over the cliff, her desperate screams captured with chilling clarity. The footage continued, showing Marcus's arrival, his confrontation with Grant, and the fight that ensued. When the video ended, the room was silent. The older detective rubbed his temples, his demeanor conflicted. "This is bad," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Marcus leaned forward, his voice low but resolute. "Bad. This is more than bad. That man shouldn't have a badge. He shouldn't be allowed anywhere near people he's supposed to protect." The younger officer nodded in agreement. "The footage leaves no doubt about Grant's actions. He abused his position and put a child's life in danger." The older detective sighed, his shoulders sagging. "We'll have to bring this up the chain. Grant will be placed on administrative leave, and an internal investigation will be launched." "But Marcus," he said, his tone softening, "you know this doesn't mean the system will work as it should. It rarely does in cases like this." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "So what? You're telling me he might get away with this? That's not justice. That's not good enough." The detective met his gaze, his expression grim. "I agree. But the reality is, it'll take more than this video to hold him accountable. You need to prepare for a long fight." Marcus's fists tightened, but he nodded. I'm ready. I'll do whatever it takes. Back in the main office of the station, Amara sat in a chair, her blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. She watched nervously as Marcus was escorted out of the interrogation room, her heart leaping at the sight of him. "Dad," she cried, reaching out her arms. Marcus rushed to her, kneeling to pull her into a tight embrace. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." The younger officer approached, her expression soft. "Mr. Reed," she said, "we're releasing you for now. But I need you to understand that this isn't over. Grant's going to fight back. He'll use every resource at his disposal to paint himself as the victim." Marcus looked up at her, his jaw set. "Let him. I'm not afraid of him." The officer nodded. "I believe you, and I'll do what I can to make sure the truth comes out. But you need to be careful. People like Grant have connections." Marcus rose to his feet, keeping a protective arm around Amara. "Thank you for your help," he said, "but I've dealt with people like him before. He might think he's untouchable, but I'll prove he's not." The ride home was quiet, the weight of the day's events pressing down on both Marcus and Amara. As they pulled into their driveway, Marcus glanced at his daughter, her small face still pale with lingering fear. "We're going to be okay," he said softly, more to reassure himself than her. Amara nodded but said nothing. Inside the house, Marcus sat down at the kitchen table, his hands gripping the edges as he thought about what lay ahead. He knew he had to prepare, not just for the legal battles, but for the emotional toll it would take on both him and Amara. He wouldn't let Grant or anyone else strip them of their peace. "Dad." Amara's small voice broke through his thoughts. He looked up to see her standing in the doorway, her teddy bear missing, but her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "Are they going to believe us?" she asked, her voice trembling. Marcus rose, crossing the room to kneel in front of her. "They'll have to," he said firmly, "because we have the truth on our side. And no matter how long it takes, I'm going to make sure they hear it." As he hugged her, a new fire burned in his chest. The fight was far from over, but he was ready. For Amara, he'd face anything. The triumph of justice. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of challenges for Marcus and Amara. The fight for justice turned out to be more arduous than either of them had anticipated. Marcus had been released, but the shadow of the confrontation in the forest loomed over them. The media had gotten hold of the story, and the narrative was far from favorable. Headlines flashed on TV screens and online news outlets. "Father assaults police officer in forest altercation," and "Hero officer claims self-defense against angry parent." The smear campaign against Marcus was relentless, fueled by Grant's connections within the police department and his efforts to twist the story in his favor. But Marcus refused to be cowed. He spent his days meeting with lawyers, compiling evidence, and reaching out to community organizations that specialized in fighting systemic injustice. Amara, though shaken, showed remarkable resilience. She insisted on accompanying her father to meetings and press conferences, her quiet strength a reminder of why Marcus was fighting so hard. A spark of hope. One morning, as Marcus sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the doorbell rang. He opened the door to find a middle-aged woman with a kind but determined expression. She introduced herself as Valerie Bennett, a civil rights attorney who had heard about their case. "I've seen too many stories like yours," she said, stepping into the living room. "But this one has the potential to make a real difference." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You think we can win against him? Against the system?" Valerie smiled, her confidence unwavering. "The truth is on your side, Marcus. And you've got something powerful: public attention. If we handle this right, we can do more than win. We can expose the rot that lets people like Grant abuse their power." Over the next few days, Valerie worked tirelessly to build their case. The footage from Grant's body camera became the cornerstone of their argument, but Valerie also insisted on gathering more evidence. She interviewed Amara extensively, ensuring that her story was presented with the clarity and dignity it deserved. The courtroom battle. The trial began in a packed courtroom, with reporters jostling for seats and cameras flashing outside the courthouse. Marcus sat beside Valerie at the defendant's table, his heart pounding as the judge called the court to order. Across the room, Grant sat smugly, flanked by his attorneys. His injuries, though minor, had been exaggerated for effect, and his confident demeanor suggested he expected an easy win. The prosecution wasted no time painting Marcus as a volatile man with a troubled past. They highlighted his prior arrests, using them to cast doubt on his character. But Valerie was ready. When it was her turn to present their defense, she stood tall and addressed the jury with conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this is not just a case about a father protecting his child. This is a case about accountability, about a man in power abusing that power to terrorize a defenseless girl, and a father doing what any parent would, defending his child's life." She played the footage from the body camera, the courtroom falling silent as Grant's cruel words echoed through the speakers. The jury watched as he taunted Amara, threw her toy over the cliff, and dragged her wheelchair to the edge. The video ended with Marcus intervening, his actions clearly driven by desperation and fear for his daughter's safety. Grant's smug expression faltered as murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Amara's testimony. When Amara took the stand, the room held its breath. She sat straight-backed, her hands folded in her lap, her voice trembling but steady as she recounted the events of that day. "He told me I didn't matter," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "He said no one would care if I was gone. But my dad cared. He saved me." Valerie leaned in gently. "Amara, why do you think your father did what he did?" Amara met Valerie's eyes, then glanced at the jury. "Because I'm his daughter. Because he loves me. And because he knew no one else would help." Her words hung in the air, raw and powerful. Even the judge seemed moved. Exposing the truth. Valerie didn't stop there. She had done her homework, and her cross-examination of Grant was ruthless. She presented evidence of prior complaints against him, incidents that had been quietly swept under the rug. Other victims of his misconduct had come forward, emboldened by Marcus's case, and their testimonies painted a damning picture of a man who had long abused his badge. Grant squirmed under the scrutiny, his bravado crumbling as Valerie dismantled his defense piece by piece. The verdict. After days of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. The courtroom was tense as the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict. On the charge of aggravated assault against a police officer, we find the defendant, Marcus Reed, not guilty. Relief washed over Marcus like a tidal wave. He glanced at Amara, who was seated beside Valerie, and saw her face light up with a smile. But the foreperson wasn't done. On the matter of Officer Grant's conduct, we recommend an independent investigation into his actions, with the full support of this court. A collective gasp filled the room. For once, it seemed, the system was bending toward justice. A new beginning. In the weeks that followed, Grant was stripped of his badge and faced charges of his own. Marcus and Amara's story became a rallying cry for communities demanding accountability and reform. They were invited to speak at events, their voices inspiring others to stand up against injustice. One evening, as Marcus and Amara sat on their porch watching the sunset, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "Dad," she said softly, "do you think it's over now?" Marcus put an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "The fight's never really over, sweetheart. But we won this battle. And as long as we keep fighting, things can change." Amara nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, father and daughter sat together, ready to face whatever came next, with hope, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of their love. The aftermath. The courtroom emptied slowly, reporters and spectators whispering about the trial's outcome. Marcus sat still for a moment, holding Amara's hand. The verdict had been a victory, but the emotional weight of the ordeal lingered. Amara squeezed his hand, her small gesture grounding him. "Dad, She whispered, "We did it." Marcus smiled down at her, his eyes brimming with pride and relief. "We did, sweetheart. Together." As they left the courthouse, they were met with a barrage of reporters shouting questions and flashing cameras. Valerie stepped forward, acting as a shield between the family and the press. "Marcus, Amara, how does it feel to have won?" one reporter shouted. "Do you think Officer Grant's actions will lead to broader reforms?" asked another. Marcus glanced at Valerie, who gave him a slight nod. He stepped forward, his hand still gripping Amara's tightly. "This isn't just about me and my daughter," he began, his deep voice cutting through the chaos. "This is about accountability, about making sure that no one, no matter how powerful or protected, gets away with abusing their authority. My daughter's life was in danger because someone thought he could act without consequences. We fought, and we won, but this fight isn't over. It's just the beginning." Amara looked up at her father, her eyes filled with admiration. For the first time, she felt the strength of his words, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, voiceless, or powerless. Returning to normal. The days following the trial were a mix of healing and adjustment. Marcus and Amara worked on rebuilding their routine, though they both knew their lives would never be the same. Amara returned to school, where her classmates greeted her with hugs and questions about what had happened. She answered honestly, but briefly, wanting to move on from the nightmare. At home, Marcus began reaching out to other families who had been affected by similar injustices. He partnered with Valerie to create a foundation dedicated to supporting victims of systemic abuse. They named it the Amara Foundation, a tribute to the strength and resilience his daughter had shown. Closure. One afternoon, a package arrived at their doorstep. Marcus opened it to find a brand new teddy bear, accompanied by a note that read, "To Amara, you are stronger than you know. Never let anyone dim your light. Valerie." Amara hugged the bear tightly, tears in her eyes. "It's not the same as the one I lost," she said softly, "but it's special in a different way." Marcus knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "That's because it represents something even bigger, how far we've come, and how strong we are." The sun set. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Marcus spoke, his voice calm and reflective. "You know, Amara, what we went through. It's going to stay with us. But it doesn't have to define us. We can take what we've learned and use it to help others, to make things better for the next person who faces something like this." Amara leaned her head against his arm, her new teddy bear tucked under her other arm. "You mean we can fight for them, like you fought for me?" Marcus nodded, his chest swelling with pride. "Exactly. And you, my brave girl, are the reason I know we can." As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, father and daughter sat together, united not just by love, but by their shared determination to build a brighter, more just world. They had faced the storm and emerged stronger for it. Together, they were unstoppable.